Every summer, a team of enthusiastic researchers went to abandoned or hard-to-reach places. They were interested in vanished communities, forgotten caves, and the legends that the locals passed down from generation to generation. This summer, they chose a special place, a dense, wild forest surrounded by mountains and almost unexplored due to its isolation. The group was led by Kevin, an experienced traveler for whom risk was an integral part of life. He was accompanied by Sarah, a biologist who was always eager to find rare plant or animal species, Martin, a documentary photographer who wanted to create material for his channel, and Rick, their new member, who was more of a thrill seeker than a professional. The idea for the trip came after Kevin read an article about the unusual legends of this region. Locals claimed that deep in the forests there were creatures that did not look like humans, but also not animals. They moved silently, leaving strange footprints, and sometimes they were seen on the edge of villages. "It's nonsense, but it sounds like the perfect topic for our new project," Kevin said when he suggested the route. Martin smiled. "Legends are always nonsense, but people like it. I'm sure the video will get millions of views." Sarah was more skeptical. "Legends are legends, but if this place is so dangerous, why do people still live there?" Rick, who was always looking for an opportunity to show off his bravery, interjected. "We just need to show these locals that we are not afraid." These words were the beginning of their most terrifying adventure. The first day of the journey passed quietly. They reached the village, which was located on the border of the forest. The residents greeted them coldly. The village elder, a gaunt man with a hoarse voice, listened to their plan, but clearly disapproved. "The forest doesn't tolerate strangers," he said. "If you go there, don't expect to come back." "But you live here yourself," Sarah pointed out. "We live on the edge, and you want to go inside. These are different things." Kevin thanked the elder and decided not to waste time on persuasion. "That's how they always react," he said when they were gone. "They are afraid of their own legends." The next day, the group went deeper into the forest. At first it was exciting. Tall trees, dense foliage, soft moss underfoot. Martin took pictures, Sarah collected samples of rare plants, and Rick, as always, tried to look the bravest. "Look," he said, stopping at a strange path. There were footprints on the ground that looked neither human nor animal. "Maybe a bear?" Sarah suggested, crouching down to take a closer look at them. "It doesn't look like it. It's too weird a shape," Kevin muttered. Rick grinned. Probably, someone decided to scare tourists. On the third night, the strangeness began. They stopped at a small camp by a stream. The night was dark, moonless, and the forest was deathly silent. This immediately alerted Sarah. "Where are all the sounds?" She whispered to Kevin. "Maybe it's just a lull." But the lull was too deep. Even the insects didn't make their usual buzzing. Soon they heard the first sound, a sharp one, as if someone had hit a tree hard with a stick. "What's that?" Martin asked cautiously. "An animal," Kevin replied. But Sarah shook her head. "Animals don't make such sounds." The next morning, they discovered that some of their supplies had disappeared. "Someone took the food last night," Rick said. "They're definitely not animals," Sarah added. "No footprints, nothing." "Or we didn't look around well," Kevin countered, but even he looked worried. The band decided to move on. But the deeper they went into the forest, the more they felt that they were being watched. "Someone's following us," Martin said when they stopped for a rest. "That's impossible," Kevin replied. "If there was someone, we would have noticed him." But the evidence was in front of everyone's eyes. They found tracks that seemed to end in nowhere, heard sounds, but could not identify their source. "This is starting to sound like a cheap horror movie scenario," Rick tried to joke, but his voice sounded uncertain. The fourth night was a nightmare. The group settled down for the night near a small hill. They lit a fire, trying to stick together. Towards midnight, a sound was heard, quiet, rhythmic, as if someone was walking around the camp. "It's definitely not the wind," Sarah whispered, clinging to Martin. Rick grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "Now I'll find out everything." He turned the light in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing but trees. "Hey, if you're here, show yourself." "Stop it," he shouted. There was no answer, but the footsteps had stopped. "You see? Nothing. It was just the wind." But Kevin and the others knew it wasn't the wind. The next morning, they found strange markings on the trees around their camp. Rough, knife-cut lines that meant nothing. "Someone's playing with us," Martin said softly. "We have to go back," Sarah said. But Kevin didn't agree. "If we leave, we won't know what this place is." These words divided the group. They began to argue, and although everyone understood the danger, Kevin insisted on continuing. "We're going. If someone wants to stay, it's your choice." By the evening of the 5th day, the group came across an abandoned village. The houses were destroyed, the roofs caved in, but the presence of people was still felt in the air. "Who lived here?" Sarah whispered. "It doesn't matter," Kevin replied. "The main thing is that we have found something unique." But the village turned out to be just the beginning of their real nightmare. When the group entered the abandoned village, the air became noticeably heavier. Every step echoed hollowly in the empty streets. The wooden houses looked old and rotten, but they looked as if they had been suddenly abandoned. Kevin was the first to look inside one of the houses. There were remnants of furniture and torn fabrics on the floor, but the strangest thing was that there was a table against the wall with sheets of paper scattered on it. "Is this a diary?" Sarah asked, coming closer. Kevin took one of the sheets and began to read. "They come at night. We can hear them knocking. I tried to keep an eye on them, but I couldn't figure out who it was. We decided to leave, but Mark was missing. He was never found." Martin, who was standing behind, asked, "Do you think it's about those sounds that we heard?" Kevin shrugged, but it was obvious that he was worried. "Maybe, but they're just stories." "Then why isn't there anyone else here?" Sarah objected. They examined several houses, but the situation was repeated. It looked as if people had left in a hurry, leaving most of their belongings. They found an old map in one of the houses. It showed the area around the village, and a dot labeled cave was marked nearby. "This is what we need," Kevin said, showing the map to the others. "Do we really need this?" Rick asked sarcastically, "Did you see what happened to this village?" "We don't know what happened there. But we can find out. This is our chance to understand everything," Kevin insisted. Sarah tried to talk him out of it. "We've already gone too far. We're running out of water, food, and we don't know how to get out." "But the cave may be the key," he replied. "Maybe there's a way out, or at least some answers." After much debate, the group decided to continue on their way, although the tension between them became almost palpable. The trip to the cave took a whole day. As they went deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and the sunlight barely penetrated through the dense canopy. Martin, who was walking behind, suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" The others froze. Somewhere ahead, there was a crackling of branches, as if someone or something was moving through a dense thicket. "Is it an animal?" Sarah whispered. "I don't think so," Rick replied quietly, clutching the knife in his hand. Kevin waved his hand, urging them to move on. "We're almost there. Let's not waste any time." But each of them was now looking over his shoulder, feeling like they were being chased. By evening, they reached the cave. Its entrance was narrow, like a crack in a rock, but it seemed much bigger inside. "Is this a camp?" Martin asked in surprise, shining his flashlight on the walls. There were indeed traces of recent human presence inside. Charred remains of a campfire, scattered blankets, metal cans. "Someone was here recently," Sarah said. "But where are they?" "Maybe they left like everyone else," Kevin replied. But there was something in his voice that said he didn't believe his own words. The group examined the cave. It went deep into the rock, and strange symbols were carved on the walls. They were not letters, but primitive signs, circles, intersecting lines, arrows pointing inside the cave. "Who did this?" Sarah asked. "Maybe they were the ones who lived in the village," Kevin suggested. But Rick objected. "It looks ancient. It's like it was here before the village." Suddenly, they heard a sound. It was the rhythmic pounding that had been haunting them from the beginning. But now it was coming from the depths of the cave. "I'm not going in there," Rick said at once. "No one's forcing you," Kevin snapped. "Are you crazy?" Sarah exclaimed. "Do you really think there's anything useful there? If we don't find out what it is, we'll never understand what happened." Kevin headed deeper into the cave, despite the protests of the others. After a short pause, Martin and Sarah followed him. Rick stayed outside, saying he would be waiting at the entrance. The further they went, the stronger the sound became. The cave was expanding, and the light of their flashlights illuminated the high, damp walls. Soon they came across another camp. Everything was a mess here. Scattered things, overturned pots, torn tents. "This is bad," Sarah whispered. "Whoever was here, they left in a panic." Kevin examined one of the tents and found a note there. "We can't stay any longer. They are coming. They know we're here." His hand trembled. "We have to leave," Sarah said, fighting back tears. But Kevin didn't move. His gaze fell on another passage in the depths of the cave. They couldn't leave. They went there. "And you want to go after them? Are you serious?" Sarah screamed. "We're already here. We can't stop now." The knocking grew louder, and soon another sound was added to it, a rustle as if someone was moving stones. Suddenly, the light of Martin's flashlight illuminated something on the ground. It was a shoe. "Damn it! It's a human shoe," he whispered. There were footprints next to the shoe. They led deep into the cave. "No, we're not going there," Sarah said firmly. Kevin didn't seem to be listening. The group stood undecided. The sounds, growing louder by the moment, made their hearts beat faster. Sarah squeezed Kevin's shoulder, her voice trembling. "Do you really think there's something good waiting for us at the end of this passage?" Kevin didn't respond immediately. His eyes were glued to the footprints going deep into the cave. "If we leave now, we won't know anything." Martin, who had been silent the entire time, finally managed. "And if we go and disappear too? Are you willing to risk your lives for answers?" Kevin looked at him but didn't say anything. His stubbornness gradually turned into doubt. Suddenly, there was another sound. It was a loud, metallic sound. Everyone instinctively turned to the passage they had come from. "Rick!" Sarah exclaimed. Rick, who remained at the cave entrance, sat on a rock, trying not to give in to anxiety. He watched the forest, which seemed even more gloomy than before. Then he heard a faint crunching sound behind him. Turning his head, he saw a shadow flicker between the trees. "Kevin! Sarah!" he called loudly, even though he knew that they had gone deeper. There was no response. He stood up, clutching the lantern tighter in his hand. "If this is someone's joke, it's not funny anymore," he muttered, starting to retreat to the cave. The shadow flashed again, but this time closer. "Hey! I can see you!" Rick shouted, though his voice was shaking. He shone his flashlight, but saw no one. When he returned to the cave entrance, a sound from inside made him freeze. It was a loud bang, as if someone had forcefully closed the door. When Kevin, Sarah, and Martin ran back to the main hall, they were greeted only by emptiness. Rick was nowhere to be found. "Rick!" Kevin shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. There was no response. Could he have gone outside? Martin asked, but he didn't believe his own words. His things are here, Sarah remarked, pointing to the flashlight and backpack left against the wall. No, we have to find him. We can't just leave, Kevin said. Do you think he went there? Martin pointed to the passage where the sounds were coming from. Kevin hesitated, but gritted his teeth and nodded. Then you're going alone, Sarah said sharply. I will not sacrifice my life to play the hero. Do you think I want to do this? Kevin snapped. I just can't leave him. Sarah turned away, her eyes full of tears. She knew Kevin was right, but fear held her down. All right, I'll go with you, Martin said suddenly. But if we don't find him in 10 minutes, we're going back. Kevin and Martin began to move deeper into the cave, leaving Sarah waiting at the entrance. The further they walked, the stronger the smell became. It was a pungent, metallic smell, reminiscent of blood. Do you feel it? Martin asked, covering his nose with his hand. Kevin nodded silently, his heart pounding. They saw footprints on the floor similar to the ones they had found earlier, but now they were covered in blood. It can't be Rick, Martin said softly. It's someone else. They heard a whisper. It was so quiet that at first they thought they were imagining it. But the whisper came again. This. The voice? Kevin asked, stopping. Martin turned on the flashlight to the maximum and illuminated the passage. Rick! Stop it, he shouted. The answer was a faint groan. He's alive, Martin exclaimed, rushing forward. But Kevin grabbed his shoulder. Wait a minute. It could be a trap. Martin broke free and ran forward, his footsteps echoing in the cave. Kevin followed him, cursing himself for not being able to stop him. When they reached the end of the passageway, Martin's lantern illuminated the eerie scene. Rick was lying on the ground, his face pale and his eyes wide open. Damn it, Rick, are you okay? Martin shouted, falling to his knees next to him. Rick looked up, his lips trembling. They're here. Kevin froze in place, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Rick looked like he'd been through hell. His clothes were torn, his face was covered with scratches, and there was dirt under his fingernails. Who's there? What are you talking about? Kevin asked sharply, trying to maintain control of the situation. Rick opened his mouth, but instead of words, he let out only a faint wheeze. His body was covered with deep cuts, as if he had made his way through a dense thicket with sharp branches, but the cave was smooth and rocky. Martin tried to pick him up, but Rick suddenly grabbed his arm. His fingers clenched so tightly that Martin cried out in pain. Don't move. They're watching, Rick whispered. Who are they? Kevin shouted, looking around, but seeing nothing but shadows on the walls. Rick closed his eyes, as if he was going to say something important, but his hand weakened and he lost consciousness. Damn it, Kevin, we need to leave. Martin lifted Rick onto his shoulder, his voice filled with panic. Wait a minute. If he said we were being watched, we need to know where it came from. Kevin paused, his gaze fixed on the walls. There were bloody footprints on the stone in front of them, as if someone had held their hand, leaving long streaks. They led deeper into the cave. Are you crazy? Do you want to go after that? Martin almost shouted. I can't leave it like this, Kevin replied softly. Martin, breathing heavily, looked at Rick's lifeless body on his shoulder, then at Kevin. Good. But if you die there, it will be your choice. He began to retreat towards the exit, leaving Kevin alone. Kevin moved on. His breathing became rapid, and the flashlight seemed too weak to pierce the thick darkness. The sounds of footsteps, rustles, and strange bumps echoed through the cave. When he reached the end of the narrow passage, a huge stone hall opened in front of him. The ceiling was so high that the light did not reach the top. There was a stone altar in the center of the hall, and scattered around it were fragments of bonfires, animal bones, and something else that Kevin couldn't identify. His gaze fell to the floor. Inscriptions were carved on the stone, but they looked like chaotic lines, circles, and arrows pointing at the center of the altar. Suddenly, there was a thud. Kevin turned around, but saw nothing. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Who's there?" "Stop it," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. The only response was another thump, louder than before. This time, the sound came from right behind him. Kevin turned around, picking up the flashlight. He saw a shadow that was moving too fast for him to see it clearly. "Show yourself." "Stop it," he shouted, holding the knife in front of him. But instead of an answer, there was a low, almost mocking whisper. "You've gone too far." Kevin froze. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It sounded like it came from everywhere and at the same time from inside his head. Meanwhile, Martin, carrying Rick, reached the place where Sarah was left. What happened? Where's Kevin? "Stop it," she screamed, looking at Rick, who was exhausted. "He stayed there. I tried to stop him, but he did. He had lost touch with reality. We can't leave him there." She got up, but Martin grabbed her arm. "Listen, if you go there, you won't come back either. We don't know what's in there. Then explain to me what happened to Rick." Sarah pointed to the motionless body lying on the ground. Martin didn't know what to say. All he could do was stare at the dark passage, from which a new sound came. It was a scream. Kevin's scream. "Damn it!" he exclaimed, getting up. "He won't survive." Sarah grabbed a flashlight and ran deeper into the cave without waiting for him. Martin followed her, leaving Rick on the ground. When they reached the hall, they saw Kevin. He was kneeling in front of the altar. His hands were up to his elbows in blood, and his face was drenched in sweat. "Kevin!" Sarah screamed, running up to him. But he didn't move. His eyes were wide open, staring at the rocks in front of him. "Go away," he whispered. "They're waiting." "Who? Who's waiting?" Sarah grabbed his shoulders, trying to shake him. He looked at her, his gaze blank. "You don't want to know." Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the lights of the flashlights began to flicker. Martin grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to leave." Sarah wanted to resist, but the scream came again, much closer this time. "Please, Kevin." She tried to pick him up, but he didn't react anymore. Sarah and Martin didn't know what to do. Kevin sat motionless, like a stone statue. His face reflected a mixture of horror and doom. "He's not coming out of here, Sarah," Martin said hoarsely, pulling her by the arm. "If we stay, we'll stay here forever, too." "No." "Stop it," she screamed, struggling. "I can't just leave him." Sarah tried to lift Kevin up again, but he pulled his arm away. His eyes, red-rimmed and full of pain, fixed on her. "You have to leave. They're already coming for you." "Who?" "Kevin, we can't see anything. There's no one here." Her voice was shaking, and tears were rolling down her face. But Kevin just shook his head, looking down at the altar again. "They've always been here." These words sounded like a sentence. Martin grabbed Sarah by the waist and dragged her away while she screamed, trying to break free. "We can't leave him. Martin, please." "Stop it," she sobbed, but he continued to drag her back to the aisle. "If we stay, we'll die. Can't you see that he's already given up?" Sarah fell silent, watching Kevin's figure disappear into the darkness behind them. At that moment, they heard his last cry. It wasn't just the cry of a man in danger. It was a cry of utter despair, as if he saw something that they couldn't see. Running out of the cave, Sarah and Martin stopped at the exit to catch their breath. Their hands were shaking and their hearts were pounding in their chests. "We couldn't leave him," Sarah whispered, looking down the dark passage. "We could have done something." Martin turned to her. His face was pale but firm. He made his choice. "You've seen it." They heard a crunching sound behind them. Sarah whirled around. "Rick! We forgot Rick!" Her voice rose to a panicked squeal. But when they returned to the place where they had left him, Rick was not there. There was only blood on the ground. Her dark footprints stretched towards the forest, as if someone was dragging his body. "Oh my God!" Martin breathed, covering his face with his hands. "Who did this?" Sarah stared at the trail of blood, her legs trembling as if they were about to give way. Martin turned the flashlight towards the woods, but saw no one. "We need to leave." "Immediately," he said, grabbing Sarah's hand. "But what if he's still alive?" She struggled, her voice filled with hopelessness. "We don't know who did it. We don't know what's going on here. If we stay, we won't leave this forest." They started running. My feet stumbled over the rocks, and the flashlights barely illuminated the way. The forest around them was depressingly quiet, as if all living things were holding their breath. Soon they came to a clearing. This place seemed familiar to them, but something about its atmosphere was wrong. Sarah froze, staring at the ground. There were things scattered on the grass: her backpack, Martin's camera, Kevin's shoes. "Why is it here? We weren't passing by." Her voice faltered. Martin looked around. Things were scattered chaotically, as if someone was trying to find something. It's a trap," he said, backing away. At that moment, Sarah noticed something between the trees. The dark figure stood motionless, staring straight at them. "Martin," she whispered, pointing towards the forest. He turned his head slowly. Another figure appeared from the other side. Then another one. They surrounded them, getting closer with every passing moment. "Run!" Martin shouted, pushing Sarah towards the path. They started to run, but the figures were moving faster. Their footsteps were as soft as the whisper of the wind, but they were getting closer and closer to them. Sarah fell, her foot caught on a root. Martin turned to help, but one of the figures was already standing next to her. He lunged at her, waving his flashlight, but the blow disappeared into the void. He was surrounded. The last thing Sarah heard before her eyes closed was a whisper. "You should never have come here." When she woke up, it was morning. She was lying in a clearing, and the forest was all around her, quiet and serene, as if nothing had happened. But Martin was nowhere to be found. Her things were neatly stacked nearby. The camera, which she didn't remember leaving, was on top of her backpack. Sarah picked it up and turned it on. They were on the tape. All four of them: Kevin, Martin, Rick and her. But the video ended with a strange shot. Dark figures stood in a circle around them, silently looking into the lens. Sarah continued to stare at the camera screen. Her breathing became rapid, and her fingers trembled. She rewound the recording to make sure she wasn't imagining things. The video showed figures standing in a circle around them over and over again. The last seconds of the recording were particularly creepy. The camera turned as if someone had deliberately pointed it at Sarah's face. Her eyes were wide open, her mouth slightly open, as if she was saying something. But she didn't remember that moment. She soon realized that the forest was too quiet. No rustling, no birdsong. Only her own footsteps and the faint sound of the wind. She started walking along the path, hoping to find her way back. But the further she went, the more the trees around her became monotonous. They all looked the same, and Sarah realized she was moving in a circle. "No, no, no," she whispered, bursting into tears. Her legs hurt and she was dizzy from dehydration, but she kept walking. At sunset, she came out to the same clearing again. It was impossible, but the things were there, as before, neatly folded. The camera was still on, and the red recording light was blinking. Sarah picked it up. A new video appeared on the screen. She clicked play. Kevin was on the tape. He was standing at the altar in the cave. His face was covered with dirt, and his eyes were blank. We thought we could understand them. But that's not possible. You can see them already, can't you? Kevin's voice was low, almost a whisper. They took us. And they'll pick you up too. The recording was interrupted by a crackling sound, and then the camera screen went out. Sarah swung her arm and threw the camera to the side, but the sound of it hitting the rocks reverberated in the silence of the forest like a gunshot. At night, she tried to sleep in the open air. Hunger, fear, and fatigue hampered her, but she was running out of strength. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by a familiar sound, a rhythmic knocking. She sat up abruptly, looking around. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was Martin. Martin! She exclaimed, jumping to her feet. He was silent, his head was bowed, and his body was slightly tilted forward. Say something. Stop it, she screamed, her voice shaking. Martin slowly raised his head. His eyes were empty, and blood was flowing from the corner of his mouth. You came here on your own, he said hoarsely. At that moment, Sarah realized that this was not her friend. She screamed and ran into the woods. It was getting light when she stopped. Her body was no longer responding, and her legs were buckling. Please, just let me out, she whispered into the void. But no one answered. She heard a rustle. Slowly turning around, Sarah saw figures coming out from behind the trees. They walked slowly, surrounding her. Sarah sat down on the ground, covering her face with her hands. Do whatever you want. I can't take it anymore, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. The figures approached. She could see them better now. They were human, but their faces were disfigured and their bodies mutilated. She saw Kevin, Martin, and Rick among them. They stood over her, their faces expressionless. You're staying with us, Kevin said softly. Sarah raised her head, her face wet with tears. Why? But there was no answer. They were just watching. A moment later, one of the figures lifted something heavy. The last thing Sarah saw was a black spot covering her eyes. When the rescue team found their camp a few weeks later, they found only their belongings. No bodies, no footprints, no notes. A knife was left on one of the tents. The words were carved on the blade. We were here, but they took us away.